Yes, thank you, Vlad, for the nice introduction, and thanks to CANactions to invite me. Actually, I already had 2 very profound days here with a group of participants which sits amongst you, discussing actually the role of integrated planning. And what I will share with you tonight, I was discussing a bit with Vlad what could be of interest to the audience, and the idea was to share with you maybe a bit more of an international perspective. And don't expect me now to show you the plan. We were even discussing over the phone, do you really mean master planning? No, it's a wordplay. I want to say, how do we master planning in complex urban realities? And this is really at the core of what I'm interested in terms of teaching and in terms of research, to understand what could be our role of those who somehow within their profession deal with the urban environment and deal with that complexities and try to find answers within that. I've been working, well, as just briefly to my background, I, as maybe many of you, studied architecture and urban design, both of it, and I worked for a couple of years for an agency which was funded at that time through the Federal Ministry for Environment in Germany, and we were supposed to consult municipalities about their way to get into sustainable urban development. And there I already got in touch with the complex urban realities. But I also spent some time in South Africa and working around this local Agenda 21 process there, which helped me to get a position at TU Berlin to coordinate the cooperation with South Africa and to work more strongly in that context. So I did my PhD to understand housing provision in South Africa. So tonight I will share with you something about the South African context as well. And then I worked for a brief while as an urban specialist for the Council on Global Change. That's the advisory council for the German government before I joined the University of Stuttgart now. I'm now the head for international urbanism, and I'm at the same time the director for an international master degree in integrated urbanism and sustainable design. So this is just a brief on my person. Now, what I want to discuss with you tonight is, first of all, how can we actually frame urbanization, and what 3, I will just put it into 3 complexities we can actually look and understand the current processes and dynamics, and what conclusions can we draw from that. And at the end, if there's time, I might share with you some slides of the work we've been doing in the past few years in Stuttgart. So this is just as an entry point, because what is happening in the last years is that in many newspapers or news you will hear about this quite statistical jargon, I would say, that yes, half of humanity or even more of them are living in cities by now. And I think by now this kind of statistics is a bit boring, because it doesn't tell us a lot. It doesn't tell us a lot really about the reality of complex urban realities, and it's just being used by policymakers to actually claim that more resources or more focus should be given to the role of cities in that regard. The first complexity we deal with, and the first difference against this real statistical average of 50%, is that if we look in the global condition, that actually we will find regions in this world which are already highly urbanized, and where there's maybe still some urban growth taking place, but where there is not the majority of people at the moment on the move into the cities. Whereas you will see other parts, like in Africa, or also some parts in Southeast Asia, where at the moment it's maybe not yet really urbanized to a large degree, but where many people are on the move into the cities. And this regional difference we need to understand also in a second aspect around the differences of this dynamics of this current urbanization process. And I really like this illustration by the Urban Age project, where they just show how within an hour some cities are growing. So while we are sitting here, within the next hour, cities as Kinshasa or cities as Dhaka are growing by 50 inhabitants per hour. And I think just to have that in the back of your mind, that these cities at the end of the day have more than 1,000 citizens more, which in some context would constitute even a small municipality. And you can just imagine what that would mean in terms of infrastructure delivery, of providing houses, of providing education, or of even giving jobs to those people who move into these cities at the moment. And you can just imagine of how planners or those who are in a role of decision making are under pressure to see how they can meet the demands which are arising with these kinds of processes. At the same time, all these statistics don't really tell something what we are often interested in. What about the spatial form? How will it actually look like at the end of the day? A lot of research research attention has been given to so-called megacities. So those cities which have really a high amount of people. We are talking about cities with 10 million people or more. But what is a bit under the radar, both in terms of research maybe, as well as in terms of policy making, is those cities which attract actually a high number of those who are on the way to the cities. And these are sometimes small or medium-sized cities which are growing dynamically. Secondly, there is a new phenomenon emerging where cities are more or less amalgamating, creating corridors, creating mega-urban regions. And these new kinds of spatial constitutions is, for instance, a part where GIZ has created a new sector project dedicated to mega-urban regions and the specific, for instance, governance challenges which come along if cities come together as so-called corridors or mega-urban regions. Another aspect which is not touched upon and which is another spatial, let's say, outcome of this urbanization process is that you will have regions which grow together and create a kind of urban-rural continuum. So what you see here as a picture from NASA, a satellite image, is basically the corridor which is being created between Cairo and Alexandria. It's about 230 kilometers long, and it becomes basically one mega-urban region. But at the same time, within this spatial continuum, you will see that a large part is even used still for agricultural production, which is used for export. So we cannot really delineate anymore very clearly what is a city and what is actually rural. And in that kind of difficult situation, where is actually the boundaries of the one and the other? This has become part of what Christian Schmidt and Neil Brenner would even refer to as planetary urbanization, when they would say that many of the activities we have in the cities, many of the resources we use, have an effect outside the city. They would even claim that the sea or mining areas and so all have to do with that humanity is on the move into the city and linked to the resource use within the city. So that is why they would refer to this process as some kind of planetary urbanization. Now, what I'm interested in is actually all of that, what we've discussed until now, takes the city more or less as an object. Yeah? It's a very passive understanding, the city as an object we observe. Another way of understanding cities is much more understanding them as active. Yeah? Cities as actors. And there is research which you might be familiar with, which is research on understanding cities as world or global cities. Saskia Sassen or Taylor were those who really promoted a new understanding of cities as being nodes in the economy and of concentrating a command power of businesses within these cities. At the same time, there are researchers which claim that also these cities, because our nation states might be dysfunctional, that the level of city government will become more prominent in the future. Benjamin Barber was one who really promoted we should pay more attention to the possibilities which are there if cities would network and would have a stronger impact on governance. Nevertheless, I think this kind of view doesn't pay enough attention towards that cities are in a situation that they are also competing. Many cities want to present themselves in the world economy as being world-class cities, of being the ones who can attract foreign direct investment. And as it be Johannesburg or Delhi or other cities, they all strive towards this kind of image making towards world-class cities, and they will use different instruments to ensure that they are regarded in that way. And some of these instruments would be, for instance, to also use mega events in that regard, to use them as a way to showcase a new image of their own city. So cities cannot just easily network and collaborate with one another. Cities are also in a situation where they would compete against one another. But in a way, this world is interconnected, and these cities are interconnected, and this is why Rem Koolhaas stated that it's actually not so much the place as such which will become important in the future, but the accessibility of as many places as possible which will be important. Now there's another way of understanding cities, which is still part of understanding cities as an active part of urban development, but which takes it even a step forward of saying it's actually the people within the city who are those ones who are innovative, who through their everyday practices, how they in their everyday live in the cities constitute about what the cities are about. And Calhoun and Sennett were the ones who brought forward with their research a kind of, in German we say Stadtmachen, it's Poesis, the word which they use for the human activity by the everyday people which constitute space. And here it's about to understand what is actually the social organization within the city, the actors which shape really collaboratively transformation. And that is very much to the core of my research interest, to understand actually what is the role of actors in cities for our urban transformation. Now I would like to invite you to a small change of perspective, and I would like to take you for a moment to South Africa to make this, what I've mentioned just now, a bit more clear. So here you see Nokwesi Klaas. Nokwesi Klaas is actually, she's living in an informal settlement. She's about 40 years old, she's got 3 children, and at the same time she is part of something which is more or less a global network. She is part of a community organization which is linked across the globe. And although this might seem to you a bit strange to look at, she's sitting here in an informal dwelling, and behind her she has put up the world map. Now, people like Nokwesi Klaas are part of what is called the urban poor, and they are considered that between 2000 and 2030, the number of those living in informal settlements will double and will arrive at a number of about 1.9 billion people. But I think still that doesn't actually explain to us what her concrete situation is, because one complexity we have to deal with is that within each context the situation needs to be understood. What are the different influencing factors? Now that Nokwesi is situated in South Africa means that urban poverty goes along with a high degree of inequality. Cape Town, where she's living, is one of the cities which is top ranking on the list of the most unequal cities in the world. At the same time, she has to deal with issues such as lack of infrastructure delivery and weak governance. And these components really characterize her possibilities to actually improve her life and to improve the situation in her community. Now, the first complexity I want to highlight to you is that we have to deal with very complex challenges. And these complex challenges are often coupled, that the urbanization process is coupled with certain specific characteristics. And these are not the same between Cape Town or Delhi, or between Delhi and Rio de Janeiro. In South Africa, there is, as I highlighted, the urbanization process really coupled with issues of urban poverty and social polarization. which as a conclusion means that international planning studies should actually study more closely and exchange, in this case, with development cooperation. And in terms of tackling these challenges, what the South African state has strived for is about a change of how to actually ensure housing delivery. And this change goes along also with the change of what the role of government is, which had a strong role in actually delivering housing, because there was a great lack of housing in this context, towards ensuring an enablement of that civil society and other actors are able to contribute to the housing development themselves. And also of understanding that housing itself is not just a product, something which one puts out there, because the realization was that many people had to move on to the peripheries of the cities and lacked their access to job opportunities. And instead to understand this whole housing process and provision of housing as part and parcel of tackling also and addressing the other needed issues of urban poverty and so on. So instead of having a housing delivery which just looked at the quantity of housing being delivered, it was about changing housing delivery to something like a process which looks more on the quality and the outcome of that process. But at the end of the day, projects which were striving for this kind of change are still in a kind of infancy stage. You would find pilot projects who would try out a different way of providing houses. And since there's probably many architects in the room here, a most familiar one would be, for instance, the approach which Aravena showcased to us, where one tries through an incremental approach to provide access to housing, which can over time being improved and further investments giving to the housing. But a realization we have with these kinds of pilot projects is often that they're not really scaling up, not really spreading out, not really taken up by others. And one argument I want to share with you here is that as a background to that could be that there's still a lot of reliance on just one actor to scale up or provide these kind of new solutions. Instead of giving more, let's say, focus or interest into how does the city actually function? Who would be the people who would be able to scale up or take forward new approaches? And in the reality, in many contexts I've been working with, the majority of what contributes to urban development is provided outside formal planning processes, which is all framed as informal. And that might relate to how do we provide transport and mobility to our citizens, how do we provide infrastructure, how is labor being created, or even how are our cities being governed. And there's even a quote by Reinhard Goethert who said, maybe we as planners need to not look on how can we integrate our citizens into formal planning, but how can we become more sensible in the informal processes which are the majority of how our cities are constituted. So one claim here, or one conclusion from this, is to more consider these actor constellations, these complex actor constellations, which actually ensure that our cities are more or less functioning. Now, there is the third and last complexity I want to attract your attention to, and that is that we actually are in a phase where we cannot talk about just the locality of a city. It has to do with that whatever we deal with in cities is not just confined to one locality. And here is, I think, a quite important quote by Uwe Altrock, who said, at the end of the day, if we look at urban governance, it has to do with the interplay of various actors with regards to the production and implementation of spatially relevant decisions on city level. And then the important part comes. No matter if these actors themselves are constituted on city level. And this might sound very abstract to you, but if you think about your everyday reality in how your cities are developing, it is often that there are investors from the outside, or that there's elites who come in with their money, who drive certain projects, develop certain parts of the city, and they're not the ones where you can say they really identify with the place or they were raised in that place. We sometimes have maybe a very romantic and naive idea who are the citizens or who is making the city. But since there's a lot of research being done towards those powerful coming from the outside, I think we sometimes forget that even those we perceive as being more poor or marginalized are also not only anymore restricted to their small community. Manuel Castells often said, he said, there is something like a space of flows. That's for those who can afford this and who have the money to be part of this. And there's the space of place for those who do not have enough money in the pockets and who have to rely on the social capital within their community. I'm not sure if this is still true of what is taking place, because there's also something which we would call as transnational urbanism from below. Some research is being done in terms of migrants and how are they interconnected worldwide and supporting one another in this regard. There's research in the development cooperation being done about remittances. Indians who live in Canada and who reinvest or bring money back to their families, who then invest this into their communities and so on. But this is not what we have been focusing on and studying. We have been more focusing on something else, and that takes me back to Nokwesi Klaas, because she is part of Czech Slum Dwellers International, and that's similar to other urban poor networks like the Asian Coalition of Housing Rights, who try through a set of practices to build social organization, both on a local level, through saving clubs they organize, or through information gathering about their situation in their settlements. But they would use that as a powerful tool to connect amongst each other and to exchange experience, as well as to approach their local government and national government and go into partnership. And this just indicates how much they would also travel and meet across the globe. And what we were interested in our research is, does it make a difference in terms of how they can be active in local urban processes if they're just one local community-based organization, or if they're part of this larger network? And the reality was that just as being part of the larger network, they were able to have a different standing in all this, what goes along with negotiations around urban development processes in their cities. Now, with these three complexities, that really brings me towards what is interesting in terms of teaching, but also in terms of research. So one interesting question which goes along with that is, what is actually the spatial dimension of the social problems I was highlighting in the beginning? Another one would be, what are opportunities that are there to coordinate this increased diversity of actors we find in our cities? And how can we ensure the inclusion of more marginalized parts of society? And aims which come along with that is to, for instance, if I work with students, to have also an idea of how can we become not only designers of products, but become also designers of processes. How can we work more across disciplines, but not only across disciplines, but also to work outside of science with practitioners, with residents and so on, and to build up the social and intercultural competence we need later as urban practitioners. So as a final summary of these three challenges, the first challenges had to do with, when we talk about urbanization, we don't talk about just one challenge. We talk about urbanization being coupled with specific challenges which go along with specific contexts. So urbanization doesn't bring along just this one challenge. And that to deal with this challenge has to do with working more incrementally. There's not the one-size-fits-all ready-made solution, but we might have to think about more steps and phases towards a solution, and to maybe even cluster components towards the solution. A second complexity I was highlighting to you is there is not the one actor who will bring that solution. We have to take into account that cities are made by a diversity of actors, and in many contexts this diversity of actors has to do with something which is coined or regarded as informal and which is not being taken into account sufficiently maybe, and that we have to do with that complex actor situation and include that into our planning processes. So it has to do with cooperation. The third and last complexity I was highlighting was the one about the multi-levels, and that we nowadays have actors in the city who are not just local, who are somehow connected worldwide, and to incorporate these different levels and into our practices and learning. So it has to do with coordination. Now, towards the end, I would still like to share with you some of the work we've been doing in Stuttgart, and just as some images. So we were for a while paying attention to specific situations which we called border zones, where we said certain conflicts and processes are visible along border zones. And here we had a studio together with Ted Cruz and others in Tijuana at the border between Mexico and the US, where there's quite a lot of informal settlements emerging along that border because of that situation across the border. And at the same time, or following year, we were working in Belfast, and it was actually a quite difficult point of time. It was clear that the UK will go for the Brexit, and the people in Belfast were very scared of what that would mean. Since they had the peace accord, it was a way forward, and they were fearing that they're falling back into old times. But even now today, you will have the peace lines within Belfast as a border zone within the city, which creates a very complex situation for many to deal with. We are, for a couple of years, having now a project in informal settlements in Cairo, where we, together with residents and young academics, develop something as a participatory needs assessment. So what are appropriate tools in this context to understand better what are the needs and the ideas of residents living in informal settlements, and by doing very small-scale upgrading measures in terms of testing these approaches. We've got two projects which are funded through the federal state of Baden-Württemberg, which strive forward a new way of understanding science, where we from university have to work actually much closer with those who are making the city. And I get a bit of, how do we say, dirty hands, yeah, because sometimes I think universities tend to step back and say, what you are doing is messy. And we did today a role play. I think for us this is like a major experiment in role play to see the difficulties once you become part of city making. This one project here is called Stadtraumbildung. It means it tries to understand the role of education and the role of schools in terms of not just being that place of a school, but where does actually learning take place is one question. And the other question, what role do schools actually play within their neighborhoods? And for that we, for instance, have the authorities which relate to schools as partners. We have the teachers and the students as partners. And we would, for instance, organize the phase 0 for them. I think I heard the last days that this is familiar to you, like a pre-phase for architectural project where we would organize like a student competition, and then we bring these actors together, and they would for the first time actually meet and sit around one table to discuss their diverse interests and ideas about the reform of these school buildings. And another project, I was discussing the 2 days a lot. Stuttgart is famous for its car industry, but it's lately famous for its car industry, maybe not in the best sense of the word, but we struggle in the city with actually car-based mobility. You must imagine that many people commute into the city for work, and Stuttgart is also known for a fine dust problematic. It's even being blamed by the EU for not keeping within regulations, and for many years the city is struggling with bringing down basically fine dust levels. Many in the city believe that it's maybe just a question of technology and of having the right technology, of changing from an oil-based tank to e-mobility and so on. With our project we try to claim that mobility is much more, change of mobility is much more than a change of technology. It has to do to understand mobility as something which has to do with your health, with your activity, with where do you meet people. So we framed this project Sustainable Mobility Culture. And what we wanted to showcase is also that a change of how we move in the city might bring new qualities to urban space in the city. And in that project, civil society actors were invited to bring forward their own project ideas of what they would like to see as experimental change in the urban space. So, and we would basically accompany them. We would be the ones who would help them to realize these ideas for a short term of time. And what you see here is one of these experiments where the city over the period of 3 to 4 months gave us about 10 parking lots in the city to be transformed through the ideas of citizens. And it might sound very small and very naive, but you cannot imagine the kind of public response this project received. Even the yellow press would claim the university steals our parking lots. Many businesses were very worried that this is now the new approach, and that their businesses will be affected by that because people cannot park in front of their shops anymore. And so very strong interests came to the foreground, but in a way I felt it was also very helpful, because if we do not have these kinds of projects where we can come together as citizens and come to an agreement, what do we actually want of our city in the future? Because others would say, well, I want to have more space for our children, we need to have more playgrounds, we need to have more quality space to sit and so on. So these are different interests, and if we do not have spaces of basically testing where do we want to go to, or have a felt impact of how the city could qualitatively change. So this kind of parking lot, just as a case in point, it was actually one of my Mexican students who did it, and he called this project Casa Schützenplatz. And seemingly this whole neighborhood adopted him. They just loved him, and they said, we want that this project continues. So the neighborhood created an association, and they approached the city to make sure that this project can continue. So sometimes I think from these very small-scale interventions, something else can emerge and can come up. This just as an example of how we work with our international master degree. We also always work in the city. There was quite a few years where we worked about the inclusion of refugees in Stuttgart. And another project we are involved in at the moment has to do with the energy transition in Germany, the Energiewende. The claim of that project is, well, Stuttgart is situated at the Neckar River, and as you can see, it doesn't look as the most beautiful and most attractive part of the city. Many who come to the city even say, I didn't even know you have a river. So it's alongside the river you will have industrial uses, but also you will have large-scale energy providers alongside the river. And the claim of the project is, if the Energiewende, the energy transition, is being taken as something, as a serious process ahead, new land will be available along the river. And maybe this is a window of opportunity in time to rethink together with citizens how can they access the river and how can the river become part of urban quality of life within the city. And we're still in a quite experimental phase around this, but we're working together with the city government who's interested to take this project forward. And this, last but not least, is the IUSD program, which was initiated as a double degree master. So we run it together with the CANactions University in Cairo. One can study it in the first year in Stuttgart and second year in Cairo, but also fully in Stuttgart. And I think what is unique about the program, and really still a challenge also for us to realize, is we invite students from across any discipline who are interested in urban development to study in this program. And we try also to teach across disciplines. And we try to get the students to really work also outside the classroom, to be in touch with reality. We call it reality-based learning, and to really impact and work with actors outside of university. Okay, this is it from my side, but I hope and I look forward for any questions or comments you bring along. Thank you.